In this video, we're going to discuss utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is the first of the reason-based universalist moral theories that we're going to discuss. This moral theory focuses on consequences, as we'll see. So these are the original utilitarians. This is Jeremy Bentham. He lived from 1748 to 1842. And this is his student and protege, John Stuart Mill, who lived from 1806 to 1873. And just to set a little bit of the background, the historical background in place, before we begin discussing the theory of utilitarianism, as many of you know, the late 18th and 19th centuries were a time of major social and political upheaval. We had the American Revolution from 1775 to 83, the French Revolution from 1789 to 99, the European revolutions of 1848, the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865, the Industrial Revolution from 1760 to 1840, and that's just focusing on Western issues. The whole world was going through quite a bit of rapid change, disassembly and reassembly. And when those things begin to happen, for all of their negative outcomes, some of the positive outcomes is that thinking begins to be shaken up. And utilitarianism is a product of this sort of social and political upheaval. So, stands to reason that in the midst of all this change, people would begin to think differently about ethics. And the old ways were open to challenge, just like I said a moment ago. And against this background, Jeremy Bentham's argument for a new conception of morality had a powerful influence. Prior to roughly this period of time, morality was largely, or had been for quite a long time, religion-based. And it could also be a matter of the divine right of kings or queens and what they say you ought to do. Right? That sort of authority was starting to be shaken to its core. And this is the background that Jeremy Bentham's new theory came out of. And again, before we get into the theory itself, I wanted to note that Jeremy Bentham is considered one of the most progressive secular philosophers of all time, way ahead of his time. So, for instance, he advocated individual and economic freedom, separation of church and state, freedom of expression, equal rights for women, the right to divorce, decriminalization of homosexual acts, the abolition of slavery, animal rights, the abolition of the death penalty, abolition of physical punishment as retribution or punishment for crime, and prison reform. And he's also responsible for the design of a particular type of prison known as a Panopticon. And this is a drawing done by a colleague and friend of his named Wiley Reveley. And what Bentham thought was that just putting criminals, just locking them up essentially and throwing away the key was barbaric. And that it didn't do anything to help the prisoner understand him or herself, mainly himself, or the gravity of his crimes and the effects of his crimes. right? So his idea was this: what if we build a prison where there's a guard tower in the middle, and then we'll situate all of the cells around this center, like, watchtower, so that the guards can see into every single cell, and all of the prisoners in turn were constantly conscious of the fact that they were being watched. Now, his idea was that part of the reason for criminality was that certain people did not have a well-developed conscience. They had never had the opportunity to develop an inner voice that might prevent them from committing these crimes. And if that was the case, then how could any of their criminal acts really be their fault, right? If they hadn't developed what it takes to stop themselves from committing the crime, then how can they be expected to honor the law or the rights of others? So his idea was that if they felt as if they were always being watched, this would make them more self-conscious because they actually were being watched, and that this would help them develop that inner monitor that is required in order to be a moral person and a law-abiding person. So I think currently there's about 300 prisons worldwide that actually adopted this Panopticon model, and this prison is in Indiana specifically. So, utilitarianism in a very basic nutshell. Morality, the issue of morality. It's not a matter of pleasing God or the king, nor is it a matter of faithfulness to abstract rules. Morality is nothing more than the attempt to bring about as much pleasure as possible in the world. That's the function of morality, right? So to answer the question here, why be moral? There's a reason to be a moral person and have a moral code. The reason is, Bentham stipulated, that morality brings about pleasure. Now, it's not just a matter of the kind of pleasure where, you taste something delicious. You're like, so pleasant and delicious. The idea of pleasure in Bentham's thinking functions in a more specific way. It's that his idea was that when people are in a state of pleasure as opposed to a state of pain, their reason functions better. They can think more clearly when their needs are satisfied and things are pleasant, as opposed to when they're in pain. When you're in pain, you tend to make rash decisions and lose your ability to think rationally. So that's more of an accurate description of what he meant by pleasure. Some grounding ideas. Human pleasure, like we just said, is the ultimate moral good, and it's desired for its own sake and not as a means to another end. So in other words, it's not merely instrumentally good, it's intrinsically good. We pursue pleasure, Bentham says, for its own sake, not as a way to get to something else. Everything else that's desired, whatever it may be, is desired because it's expected that it'll bring about pleasure. In other words, everything else we might want in life, we really want it because we think it's going to bring about this ultimate moral good, which is pleasure. So we desire money. Why? For pleasure. We desire success. Why? For pleasure. We desire relationships. Why? For pleasure. So all of those things, money, success, relationships, would all be considered instrumental goods, instrumental in gaining you what is intrinsically good, and that's pleasure, he would say. So if all of this is the case, then actions that we take on a daily basis should be evaluated in light of their consequences. What sort of effect do they have on the world and other people and ourselves? Are they bringing about more pleasure in the way that we've just defined it, or are they bringing about more pain? Intentions, or what you would like to happen, are irrelevant under the utilitarian schema. So here is the principle of utility. Now, just like science and math will have principles and axioms and theorems that you follow in order to solve a certain problem, notice that these Enlightenment era thinkers were trying to do the same thing with morality. Right? You want to know what you ought to do in a morally charged situation? Well, you apply the principle of utility, and that is, one ought to do that act which will bring about the greatest quantity of pleasure for the greatest number of persons or the community. When you're faced with a moral dilemma, should I do this or that, you run through a sort of calculus and you try to figure out which one is going to bring about the most pleasure for the most people, and then you have reason on your side, and that guides your decision. That will tell you what you ought to do in that situation, and in fact, justify whichever decision you make, insofar as you made it according to the principle of utility. So, actions are right to the extent that they promote the most pleasure for the greatest number of people, and they're wrong to the extent that they promote pain. And this also means that you may have to sacrifice your own pleasure for the sake of the greater good, like take one for the team, if that's the way that the calculus pans out for you. And I'll elaborate on that in just a bit. Further, Bentham argued that all pleasures, whether those of an animal or a human, are equal. They're not, a human pleasure is no better, or let's just keep it with better. A human pleasure is not any better than an animal pleasure. Right? They're equal. The happiness of one sentient being is no more important than the happiness of another. And a sentient being is just something that can experience pleasure and pain, and in a sense be at least minimally conscious of it, right? So also, pleasure and pain are capable of quantification and hence measure, just like math. He really wanted to create like a calculus of felicity, as we'll see in a moment. And by the way, an interesting point here is that Jeremy Bentham is often used by animal rights activists and organizations such as PETA. And I think you can see why here. They really like his thinking regarding the equivalence of animal and human pleasure, that no one is more important than the other. So in other words, he is pulling certain sentient beings into the moral community by making these assertions. And I'm sure you can see how this is a great addition to the arguments of animal rights organizations. The calculus of felicity. So Jeremy Bentham actually set forth like a rubric for exactly how you can do the math regarding the making of moral decisions. He said you have to run it through a series of categories and assign numbers to the categories, and then you actually do the math. And there's works of his out there where you could see him doing the math and saying, look, once we've run this potential course of action through the calculus of felicity and assigned the correct numerical values, it clearly indicates that we ought to do X or we ought to do Y. So here are some of those categories that he says you have to take into consideration. First, in whatever it is that you're about to do, how intense would the pleasure be that ostensibly will result from this course of activity? Like, I'm thinking of doing this thing called B, right? Well, how intense would the pleasure be from B if you did it? How long would that pleasure last? If you did B, how long would that pleasure last? Certainty. What's the probability that the pleasure will occur? Is it highly likely to occur if you do B? Or is it kind of half and half? Propinquity, that's an antiquated word, but how far off in the future is the pleasure? If you were to do action B, how long would it take for it to pay off in pleasure, essentially? Fecundity, that's another antiquated word, but what's the probability that the pleasure will lead to other pleasures? If I were to do action B, would that pleasure somehow amount to more pleasures? Like, is it fertile, right? Can it generate more pleasures and more pleasures? Purity. What's the probability that the pleasure will be free from pain, or is it a mix, right? If I do action B, how pure will the pleasure be, right? Or is there some pain mixed in there too? And also, and importantly, extent. How many sentient beings are affected by the pleasure? That means animals and humans. So if I were to undertake action B, how many feeling, thinking creatures will be affected by the pleasure I get from action B, and in what way? Could it bring them some pain, or would it bring them pleasure as well? So Bentham thought that you run your potential action through all these categories, assign numbers, and you'll find out what you ought to do. It's an entirely quantifiable procedure, in other words. Now, John Stuart Mill was a student of Jeremy Bentham, and he's squarely in the utilitarian camp as well. But he disagreed with his mentor. He disagreed with Bentham about Bentham's assertion that you can measure pleasure or happiness just as a quantity, right? Assign, this monkey 3 units of pleasure, and this person got 3 units of pleasure, so they are equal. He didn't think it was that simple. In other words, not all pleasures are equal, not between humans and animals, and not amongst humans either, John Stuart Mill said. There's qualitative differences. So, intellectual pleasures, for instance, he thought, are superior to bodily pleasures. So, just to give you an example, an intellectual pleasure might be considered listening to music, or reading a novel, right? Pleasures that occur in the intellect and that require an intellect in order to experience them, as opposed to bodily pleasures, which would be, those are easy to figure out. Sex, food, etc., right? Obviously, animals are only capable, and this is what we think, that they're only capable of bodily pleasures, whereas humans are capable of intellectual and bodily pleasures. And to Mill, intellectual pleasures are superior. So, since the animals can experience those intellectual pleasures, human pleasure is more important. And this is a quote that's actually pretty famous in the philosophy world. Better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And this quote's meant to illustrate the qualitative differences that he claimed existed amongst the pleasures. But we have to address this. How does he justify that? Right? How does he justify that intellectual pleasures are preferable or more valuable than bodily ones? Who's to say? Well, he says, right? But you have to back up your claims in philosophy. And the way he backed it up is by saying competent judges would agree. And even though I put a bunch of judge stuff there, it means really people with sufficient life experience and with enough experience with both of those types of pleasures, both intellectual and bodily, they'd agree that intellectual ones are superior. That's how he backs it up. But really briefly, just because I'm familiar with his work, he would also justify this particular claim, or actually all of it, by saying, bodily pleasures are fleeting. They come and go, and they require external stimulus. And when the external stimulus is gone, the body pleasure is gone. But intellectual pleasures are long-lasting, and they can live, in a sense, in your intellect, and you can recall them and re-experience virtually the same type of pleasure as you experienced the first go around. They have staying power that bodily pleasures lack. And so, for instance, if you've ever heard somebody who's been locked in prison who is kind of a scholar, that happens, right? And they like to read and think and write. I've heard people of that nature say, this means really nothing to me. My pleasures in life come through my intellect. So you put me in a cell. What do I really care? I'm not missing anything out in the world. I've got my reading and my writing. That's an extreme example to illustrate the point. So briefly, here's Mill's argument in premise and conclusion format. So he's got a couple of conclusions and 5 premises here, and how he argues for what's called the greatest happiness principle. And we'll talk about that in a sec. So, the only proof that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people actually hear it. So, the only proof that a thing is actually desirable is that people actually desire it. Each person actually desires happiness for him or herself. So, each person's happiness is desirable. First conclusion is the general happiness is desirable for the aggregate of all persons. Aggregate of all persons means a community. And second conclusion is essentially what's known as the greatest happiness principle. And that is, actions are right or good in proportion as they tend to produce happiness, and wrong or bad as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So when determining whether an action's moral or immoral under utilitarianism, it's going to require a few different steps. Number 1, you have to identify the various courses of action that we would take in a given morally charged situation. 2, you determine all the foreseeable benefits and harms that would result from each course of action, and for everyone that would be affected by the action. And 3, you choose the course of action that provides the greatest benefits after the harms have been taken into account. Let's put a concrete example behind that procedure. So let's imagine you find an unattended wallet with an ID and $3,500 cash inside. First step here, what could you do? What are your possibilities? Like stop the world for a second and say, whoa, what should I do? Don't think about what you're inclined to do or what your emotions tell you to do. You stop, take a breath. what are the possibilities here? Well, A, or this one here, you could take the money and run. You could turn it into the authorities. Or you could take every measure to contact the person and return the wallet. Let's say these are your three options, right? Then you move to step 2. You calculate the possible consequences for X, Y, and Z. If you took the money and ran, then who and what would be benefited? Who and what would be harmed, right? Who or what would be made happy? Who or what would be made unhappy by this? And you think that through. If you turned it into the authorities, same thing. Who or what would be benefited and who would be harmed? And then same with Z. If you took every measure you could to contact the person, return the wallet, what sort of consequences would that have? Then you do the math and choose. But the point is that you rationalize the procedure and that you think through all of this, rather than, let's say, asking your pastor or consulting your emotions or your potentially current state of need. You stop and you carefully run this process, which at first glance and admittedly looks like it could take a long time, right? By that point, I mean, really, if this person stopped and like had a seat on the concrete and said, it's time for me to do the Felicity of Calculus a la John Stuart Mill right now, somebody else would have come and taken it by then. But the point is that you're opening up these lines of thought. You're not just acting on impulse or from blind obedience to authority. You're allowing your reason to dictate what you ought to do by using essentially a risk-harm calculation. And you get better with this in time. In time, she wouldn't have to sit down and bang this out with a piece of paper. It just is like, boom, 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 pa, okay, bah. Contact the person, return the wallet. So, a few strengths of utilitarianism, or positive aspects of utilitarianism as a theory, is that because it focuses on consequences, it gives us some flexibility to bend moral rules, right? There are exceptions to moral rules. Like, for instance, if you steal stealing food to feed a starving person on the street, let's say, if you found yourself in that position, you could justify that under utilitarianism. It wouldn't be, thou art not steal. You could find some wiggle room with utilitarianism under these circumstances, because perhaps it would be for the greater good that this person be fed than that, you follow the hard rule that you ought never steal. And also it's a good answer to why should we be moral, right? If we're not taking God or the divine right of kings or just parental authority into account, why should we be moral? Well, we should be moral, and we care about morality because we're interested in making people happy so they can flourish, not miserable so they can, degenerate. And some standard objections to utilitarianism as a theory. First, many people charge that argument, the one with the premises and the conclusions, of committing the fallacies of equivocation and composition. So take a look at the main argument for this, but the equivocation is well, he's using desire and desirable in the same way, right? He's using this one word actually to mean two kind of different things. And also composition, that just because what is desirable for one person just because something is desirable for one person doesn't mean that it is desirable for the aggregate of all people. That's an illogical jumping to conclusions, for instance. Also, another objection is there are other desirable goals in life than pleasure and happiness, right? Some people just disagree with what Bentham and Mill say is the ultimate intrinsic good, pleasure and happiness. Some people say, no, the ultimate intrinsic good, that toward which all other actions are taken, are friendship, or spiritual growth, or intellectual growth, or broadening of consciousness, or appreciation of the aesthetic. So that's a common objection to utilitarianism. Also, it underplays individual integrity and personal responsibility, and allows us to justify actions that seem wrong on the face of it. So let me give you a for instance here. Utilitarian thinking, that risk and benefit and pleasure, pain, happiness, unhappiness sort of thinking in order to come to moral decisions, it could permit false criminal charges and prosecutorial misconduct if those things are rationalized as being for the greater good. Many of you have seen those programs where they just want, where somebody has committed, there's a murder in the community and they can't find the, real murderer, so they pin it on, the town clown, for instance. And, they can often rationalize that by saying, look, it was either the town clown or the whole community going bananas. So we chose to sink the town clown. And also, because only happiness has intrinsic value according to the utilitarians, it can allow us to use people as instruments rather than treating them respectfully as ends in themselves. It allows us to use people like tools. So, for instance, utilitarian thinking could permit exploiting someone's personal problems for the greater good, if and when the greater good is equated with entertainment, for instance. So this is the type of thinking you see on behalf of the producers of some reality shows, where you can watch them and you'll see that the quote-unquote stars of the shows are deeply troubled people, but they're being exploited by the producers and the creators of the show in order to entertain other people. I'm sure you've heard that thinking kicked around before. But, many producers and creators of these shows can justify what they're doing, and do justify putting these people into these shows by saying, look, we're making a lot of people happy, man, right? A lot of people get pleasure from these shows, and these people say that they want to be in them, and they're getting pleasure from the shows because now they're rich and famous. So what's the harm? Right? So a standard objection to utilitarianism is that it permits treating people in a less than dignified manner. Okay, topics covered is utilitarianism as reason-based universalist moral theory, Bentham's version, Mill's version, the strengths and standard objections to utilitarianism. One last thing. This is Jeremy Bentham at University College London, where his skeleton is on display, and it's clothed in his own original clothing, and they put a wax head on him, and they've got his mummified head. Man, it's a trip. I put a video about this stuff in the overview for this week. I think it's like 10 minutes long, but it's a real trip. And if you have a minute, you should watch it.